Welcome, everyone, both folks in the room at Auckland University and also for everyone online. So, yes, today, fantastic start of a journey for the 10th benchmark for ACODE benchmarks. In the last couple of years, we have gone through the process of revitalizing the existing 8 benchmarks and recently added the 9th benchmark, which was specifically about learning spaces and technology-enhanced learning inside physical learning spaces. And that opened up a couple of questions and opportunities, and which is leading up to what is a start of the development of our 10th benchmark, which is one specifically focused on accessibility and technology-enhanced learning. There's absolute need. I won't steal Kate's thunder because she's going to talk a little bit about that, but it's clear that a lot of the sector is clamoring for an institution-focused benchmark on accessibility and technology-enhanced learning. And the thing in terms of our initial conversations around this, we're not just going to focus on accessibility, because accessibility by itself is going to set us up for some kind of compliance checklist. And in order for an event like this to work, and a benchmark that we're hoping to develop out of this to work, it's going to have to be proactive and future focused. So we're actually incorporating and thinking about inclusion and accessibility for technology enhanced learning. And so we're really happy that you could join us both online and here in the room. And what I will do is move on to the next slide. So, e mihi ana kite rangi, e mihi ana kite whenua, e mihi ana kia no te whatua. Ho Steve, likewise, toko ingoe, no ronga oha ako ho, no mai ki tēnei wani. And in English, that is greetings to the sky, greetings to the land, greetings to our local iwi Ngāti Whatua. I'm Steve Likewise. I work at Ronga Oha Ako, which is our Central Learning and Teaching Design Unit, and we welcome you to this workshop. What are the next steps? So today is the starting. We're kicking this off, and we're really hopeful that we get some really good feedback and some ideas from the folks in the room and folks online. We have some Padlet boards set up to capture all your thoughts and questions. This is just a start. At the end of this, we will be asking for people to put their hands up and be involved, maybe, hopefully, going forward to help really put some meat on the bones for the benchmarks that we hope to eventually do a test run for next year's benchmarking process, the summit. And I think, Patrick, it's fine to say that the benchmarks, you're quite comfortable. We're going to run the external benchmarks in late June, early July at Melbourne University next year. That means that about a year from now, this benchmark has to be in reasonably good shape so that every institution, ACODE institution, can engage in the internal benchmarking process. So we've got some points where we can test out with stakeholders at Theta, ICDE, and at ACODE, and we will be pursuing an opportunity to road test these questions, getting feedback from all sorts of stakeholders, so that we know we're in a pretty good shape when we run the first run through in early next year.
Awesome. Thank you. Can all hear me? So thank you very much for the warm welcome, Steve. And as an Australian and from the Australian side of the house, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners on which we are meeting here in New Zealand and in Australia, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. We are very, very grateful to the University of Auckland for hosting us. It's fabulous to see people in the room. And for those of you who aren't here, we have the most glorious day in Auckland. It is really spectacular, and we are in an amazingly beautiful building, and we can see the beautiful day outside. So thank you. So the journey to accessibility with regard to this is actually a very personal journey for me. And I started as an educator, as a coach for horse riding for the disabled way back in the 1990s. And at that stage, I had no lived experience of disability. I was just interested in horses and really keen to help as a volunteer. And I had a friend who had a disabled daughter, and I started, and over 10 years, I was a coach, volunteer, and ended up being the president of the organisation before I left Rockhampton and moved to Southeast Queensland. From there, the reason I moved to Southeast Queensland is I have a brother who became very ill with streptococcal meningococcal disorder, and he ended up becoming a quadruple amputee. So it's quite a high profile case in Australia. Matthew Ames is his name, if anyone is interested. And he is very well now, but the journey from as a family member and as an educator has been quite profound, obviously, and huge. So that is that part. And then I happen to also be the parent of 2 neurodivergent teenagers. So I live the dream of being an educator and someone who is actually very privileged. I'm educated. I'm able to support them through their fight with systems and processes and instructions, but I live that dream. So all of that has combined to this moment where I'm in now, where I happen to be the Pro-Vice Chancellor Engagement and Access at Torrens University. It feels to me like the perfect job for me, where I feel on a daily basis in a position where I can advocate and actually look and provide that lens of equity, inclusion in everything I do and everything we do. And in this position, as president of ACODE, I'm really fortunate that the membership and the executive has also come to a position where this is actually something really important. And we certainly felt it as once we started, and I'm very, very grateful for Steve actually, and everyone else on the executive, but Steve was like, let's do this. This is really, really specifically important. So we are in a really great position that ACODE, obviously with its benchmarking, thanks to those who've come before us, Michael, Stephen in the room, a whole range of people have been involved in this benchmarking process for us. And so we're well set up. So when we talked about the accessibility benchmark, the number of people who've come on board and said, yeah, that's really needed, and it's not just about web design. Not just about universal design for learning. It's not just about all of the standards associated with that. It's about the much bigger piece of can people get in the room, etc. And I'll talk about that a little bit in my talk when I go through and ask the question, just how accessible are we and how inclusive are we? So with regard to the benchmarking, we've already started the process. We had a panel, some of you may have been on the panel a week or so ago, where we started the conversation with ICDE, where we actually asked the question, what is accessibility? What does it mean for us as institutions and within our institutions? And the very big question, what is accessibility? What are we talking about when we're going to start to benchmark? Is it inclusion? Is it pedagogy? Is it technology? Is it space? What is the scope? That is the very beginning of the journey. And that is something we are all going to need to discuss and grapple with on the process of developing the benchmarks. We don't want to be, nor do we need to be all things to all people. But what we do know is that there is a gap, but we don't actually know what that gap is, and in a really defined terms. So the process over the next year for us in working through, the process of really a co-design process, although I'm really a bit over the term co-design, but I think we all live the dream of co-design, is working out how and what we mean when we're talking about it. We don't want to do stuff for the sake of doing stuff. We're all too busy for that. We need to know how it's going to impact, what impact it's going to have, and actually how it's going to help our students and our staff negotiate that, deal with our students. But ultimately, this has got to be something that we could look back in half a decade and go, actually, you know what, that made a difference. Our places are better for this and our students are better for this. And the parents of the students and the families of the students and the communities who support the students are all benefited for this. It's not just about UDL. It's not about having more accessibility plans and accessibility staff and, you know, more budgets to help students, when in fact what we know is that if you design places and spaces and technology to incorporate the hardest person to have in the room, it's going to be absolutely easier for everybody. So what does this look like for that process? And so over the next few months, as Steve's already talked about, we will gather people, you know, bring people together, try and refine, provide feedback, go through quite an iterative cycle before really by the end of the year, the plan would be that by November, we'll have a solid set of benchmarks that we think are workable. Now, there's not going to be a 100% solution, and it's always going to be an iterative journey, particularly given that there are so many passionate people in the room and there are very different views about identities and definitions, etc. And we are, as a group, going to have to make it maybe some hard calls or you know, firm positions on, okay, that's fine, but for us, for this benchmark and what we're doing, this is what it looks like for us. So, and those will hopefully be part of some very respectful discussions and conversations that we have moving forward. So this is a particularly dynamic area that where a lot of people have passionate views, and so really thinking about how we do this process respectfully is going to be part of the job of the executive and those people on the benchmarking work group. And so really that's it for me. So I'll talk a little bit more when I go through my particular presentation. My presentation is simply starting to ask some of the questions that I think are going to come, and certainly we've already experienced in just shaking out our thinking in preparation for the rest of the day and thinking. But I think my job is now to hand over to Simon.
Yes.
To welcome us on behalf of University of Auckland. But
Kia ora. Tēnā mana, ina reo rau, maina tira mā, tēnā koutou, koutua. Ko Simon Holloway, taka whenua, ko te Iaroa Mataranga. And now, in English, to the authorities, the orators and the esteemed leaders, I greet you, I greet you, I greet you all. My name's Simon Holloway. I'm the DVC Education at our University Waipapa Tamatarau. So, can I say good morning, colleagues, both live and online? It's a little after morning here, but I'm sure it's more for many of the colleagues, particularly those in far off West Australia. It's a real pleasure to be here to welcome you to our university. Today our name is Waipapa Tamatarau, the University of Auckland, and indeed to welcome you to this workshop, the Australian Council for Open and Digital Education. I'd like to thank ACODE for their work. The focus on technical enhanced learning has been one of the many reasons that higher education in our region has been so successful. And I also want to thank Stephen and his team for organising the event, which brings together experts and practitioners from across the region, both live and online. The theme of this workshop, accessibility and technology enhanced learning, couldn't be more timely. Higher education needs to be more accessible than ever to our students. I also was in Wellington yesterday, really listening, I guess, to all those other stakeholders, including our government, who is really pushing, I guess, to see value for what they term as their investment in higher education. They do seem to commodify everything. I'm sure it's not just our government either that sees that in those terms, but I guess it does make us reflect on the necessity of providing education for a wide and diverse audience. At Waipapa Tamatarau, the University of Auckland, we are seeing growing numbers of students who identify with disabilities attending year on year, as I'm sure you're also finding at your institutions. Indeed, we're seeing a fantastic number of students. If you look outside, you'll see them packing the roadways, much to the horror of those driving. We've got to kind of move them away. In our university, a fundamental Māori principle helps guide us, manaakitanga. That is caring for those around us. And this reinforces the need for equitable access to education. And thoughtful investigation of technology to support both students, and I really need to emphasise colleagues, staff colleagues as well. At my tapa tamatarau, our Prime Vice Chancellor Equity, Kathy Stenia, Professor Kathy Stenia, who's in the audience here, has coordinated the development of a disability action plan that supports students and staff with disabilities, supports them to succeed. Some of the actions in this plan include implementing disability case management software, providing faculty support for assessments under special conditions, and auditing accessibility of web content and services. Kathy's also worked on learning indicators that provide measures of success for students with disabilities. Things, for example, participation. We're looking for a rise in the proportion of learners who are students with disabilities, achievement, measuring the rise in retention and completion rates for these students, and indeed employment, looking for a rising proportion of students who identify with disabilities as learners entering into the workforce and succeeding at the conclusion of their studies. At our university, we strive to provide equal access to all students and staff to learn when, where, and from and how they want. This means thinking about accessibility not simply as encompassing a series of standards, but as involving the flexibility of approaches needed by a diversity of learners. We strive to be proactive, not just fixing learning and teaching systems that we have to make them more accessible, but also thinking about how to enable new ways of learning and developing new accessible systems. And we need to plan these systems to make them useful, as I said before, for staff as well as students in our system. In any universal design for learning, disability among the users should be expected. AI, that is an artificial intelligence, particularly generative AI, has the potential, indeed, it's already a game changer in educational accessibility. AI allows us to change content and learning according to the learner's needs. It allows for the development of different forms of engagement, different forms of learning, and different forms of personalised learning on a case-by-case basis. Something that I'm sure we've always aspired to without AI, but in our universities with their not extensive budgets, perhaps we've had difficulties in achieving. I wonder if AI is the solution. AI can be used to create additive learning environments and personalised learning by analysing learners' progress and backgrounds, and to adapt content to their needs as well as learning outcomes. AI teachers or tutors can provide customised feedback, often real-time assistance, answering questions, guiding students through complex tasks. Many of our students are early adopters of this technology. Indeed, I'm on a school board, and I had a wonderful session a couple of weeks ago where a young 15-year-old student was explaining to his headmaster how indeed all the pupils in his school were using AI, much to the shock of the teachers. Not really. Oh yes, sir, we just use it to explain what the teachers haven't provided us. From the mouths of babes, right, comes the answer. AI investment means that far more students can benefit from individualised learning that is currently possible. The implications for accessibility are clear. We can personalise the educational experience and provide every student with an AI tutor. Education can be tailored to meet each learner's needs. This includes students with physical and learning disabilities, as well as those with different levels of preparedness coming into our institutions. At the same time, I watched a really interesting ACODE webinar that had a number of colleagues talking about AI. The emphasis that I got out of that was that AI certainly helps our students how to learn, to think without, but we need to use the AI systems to encourage them to think without the AI becoming a shortcut. We learn to think by being challenged by new facts, concepts, and ways of thinking. And we need scalable online learning and personalised support for students with diverse learning needs. But we need to provide a series of intellectual challenges using AI systems that encourage learning. And I think that's a real challenge for us. Many students see AI as a simple solution to get through their courses. What we need to do is adopt these technologies and really explore their potential to encourage the fun in learning, to challenge students while at the same time making the material much more accessible. I'm sure you will all know many more ways in which AI is being used in your own institutions or could potentially be used based on your experience. During this workshop, you will have the opportunity to actively contribute to the development of the ACODE 10th Technology Enhanced Learning Benchmark. This benchmark, I think, will be a crucial resource for our institutions, helping us to refine approaches to accessibility and technology enhanced learning, ensure that our policies and practices serve all learners equitably. I wish you all a stimulating, productive time at Waipapa today, the University of Auckland. I look forward to seeing the outcomes of your discussions and how they'll shape accessibility and technology enhanced learning across your institutions. Ngā mihi nui and haere mai, welcome once again. Kia ora.
All right, so my presentation for the next half an hour is going to look at how accessible are it. It's actually going to ask questions, setting the scene. It's asking you to think about some of the challenges that we actually have ahead of us, particularly with regard to definitions, the silos we live in with universities. You know, this is sort of, you know, we've all lived the dream, many of us, of actually some of these tensions that we have within our institutions, who's responsible for what, you know, who makes decisions about students, etc. So we have about 35 minutes, and it is intended to be interactive. So it's always interesting when you're doing a hybrid. So I have 3 scenarios I want to work through, and I have questions associated with those scenarios. And what I will be doing is asking for views from the room. Again, there's no right answers, but the 3 scenarios are realistic scenarios. They're scenarios that I have either personally encountered or dealt with in my career, and they're just literally the tip of the iceberg. But those 3 scenarios are just examples of some of the complexities that we deal with. But here's some heartbreaking stats, I think, actually, and some very practical stats. And these are apologies to the New Zealand counterparts. These are Australian statistics. So overall, 21% of people currently in Australia have a disability. So for every 100 students, you've got 20 who will have a disability, and I'd say that is conservative. So if you've got 1,000 nursing students, 200 of those nursing students are going to have a disability and will require either disclosed or undisclosed some form of support. And that includes and when you talk about the non-disclosure of neurodivergent, the people with neurodivergence, you're probably talking, you know, higher. And we do know, for example, in engineering and in mathematics and in sciences, neurodivergence is way higher than your stock standard, you know, 10% or whatever that might look like in particular cohorts and populations. So participation and completion statistics in higher education in Australia with disability are either stagnant or regressing. We are not doing a good job at all of supporting our students with disability. In Australia, completed bachelor degree or higher, 17% with disability, 35%. So there you can see there is a significant disparity between students with disability and non-disability for completion. And those who have completed Year 12 coming into the university, so this is a school issue, but they're not even getting to us, is, you know, 34% have completed disability and 66% have completed without disability. So for universities like mine, where we have quite an open access, it is a very significant question for us. How do we actually bring students into the higher education sector, perhaps even without a Year 12, or, you know, with looking at work experience, for example, as an area for improvement. So that is just the start point of some of the conversations, and there are many more statistics, but it's just not a pretty picture, and it hasn't been for some time, despite all of the efforts and goodwill associated with that. So the question for us is, what can we do to help move this forward in the right direction? We're not going to be able to solve all of the problems, but what within our remit can we do to at least not make things worse? So I think So, so here are our scenarios. So we've got one, so we're going to probably take about 5 minutes or so for each scenario. So feel free for online. Zoe's tracking the chat because I can't see the chat with regard to some of the questions. So scenario one is a person with a hearing impairment or a cochlear implant attends an on-campus class, actually in a room like this, a very beautiful room that has really got very hypersensitive microphones, which means that all sounds are amplified. So that's one option for that student. The other option for that student is the room is a standard room with no specific consideration of people with hearing impairment. And that's actually what we see in our institutions these days. We've either got the hypersensitive room like this, where someone with a hearing impairment is at the back and someone else is whispering over here. And, you know, that's actually really impacting on their ability to hear or concentrate. Or the other one is that it actually hasn't really been considered and the student is placed at the back and actually can't hear. Now, for those of us in the room, most of us are actually going to end up being hearing impaired as part of our human condition and aging. So, so it is actually something that we're going to live for ourselves, generally speaking, but for our students who are in the room, this is an issue. So the two questions are, what considerations have you already made in your institution that you know of that would support the student? And it can be either of those. And is this an education, technology and learning and teaching consideration? Because right now, a lot of our institutions might say that's a learning space issue, or that's a facilities issue. So I'm interested, and I think we are interested in hearing that. So happy to take questions, write it down for those who are here. Those who are online, if anyone actually wants to put their hand up and talk, but just take a few minutes to talk amongst your table, and then you can feel free to put your hand up and have a conversation. Again, the purpose is just to get the discussion happening. So we've got some really good conversations happening online, where there seems to be a difference between asking, where students ask for support and there is support available. Some people are saying that they actually don't know what their institution is doing, and there actually is some good practice happening. So Sheila, I think, can we hear Sheila if Sheila speaks?
Yeah. Hi, Kate. Hello. Yes, online was very, very interesting. And some of the other things that came up were things like media skills, which we don't always think about, but are a really key part of what we could do for academics in this realm. So we talked about things like people walking away from the lectern when there's a recording on, you know, so you've already lost that ability to even read a lip or get some extra assistance there. Professional development, of course, is key in this, and that's about raising the awareness of what is available. If we don't know, the academics don't know, that's for sure. So awareness and professional development. And then that kind of concept about, you know, UDL versus self-disclosure. So, you know, all about, well, not all, but a lot of systems rely on the student themselves to self-disclose. But actually, if we're really serious about UDL, it's access for everybody. Yeah, okay. They're our main themes.
With regard to in the room here, does anybody want to have anything to add or any specific points that they want to make with regard to this particular scenario? Yes.
We have a student at the moment who is deaf. So for all of her classes and her tutorials and everything, we have some New Zealand Sign Language coming to her lectures. One thing that is really hard is that they're Māori papers. So you've got less New Zealand Sign Language interpreters that can also do the Te Reo Māori.
Okay, great. Meeting challenge. Anyone else? Yeah.
I have a son who is at a different institution who has auditory processing disorder. So this particular solution wouldn't work for him at all. And to get him through school and the education system, we've actually had to spend a lot of money on a personal FM system. He has self-disclosed at AUT and he's getting good support. His twin sister is here and she's neurodivergent as well. He's also self-disclosed and is getting good support. But yeah,
Right. Absolutely. And that is a very specific one and actually is a great segue to the next scenario, actually. So I think again, this is I'm sure that we could talk about this stuff all day. So this is really what I would call a shortcut through a race through. So this one, person who's neurodivergent and is getting overwhelmed with a number of sub-platforms and requirements within their LMS. Echo within Canvas is my lived experience dream at 11 o'clock at night with my daughter not understanding or being able to upload the videos. Of course, she's left it to the absolute last minute, needs to get it in with the next 15 minutes and can't work out how to actually upload and just, you know, her in tears, me in tears. So this is, you know, is it a technology and learning and teaching consideration? And what considerations have you made in your institution that you know of that would support a student like this? So again, I'll give everybody a few minutes to have a think about that and discussion, and I'll be interested to hear the views on this one. Is it an tech issue? Yes. Yes. Stephen's saying no.
So one of the things that we were coming to at the end of the sort of conversation is the recognition that you've framed the scenario based on what the university is doing. We've been doing some research in the university, not me, looking at what successful students are using. And so the real challenge is understanding the wider footprint of tools and resources and technologies that the students themselves are bringing and need to use in order for themselves to be successful in their own individual way. So the ed tech issue, the systems issue that Patrick's talking about, particularly is how do we enable those things to be effective and how do we encourage people to use the tools that they know are ones that they're comfortable with, that are going to be the tools that lead to their success, and how do we identify and remove the either systems or organizational or behavioral or academic barriers that are introduced often without any recognition of the fact that those are going to cause significant problems for students who have good opportunities to be successful if we just got out of the way. We're just getting really.
Great. Anyone else got any views on whether this is an ed tech learning? I believe online we talked about student skills. You know, the fact that you've got consisting or conflicting platforms. This is not unique. And so the ability for a student to be able to negotiate complex thinking, you know, that is our ed tech responsibility. How much is pedagogy, how much, etc. is support. So just Travis.
Thank you. I think one of the key things when you put this one up, Kate, that occurred to me was, is it really an ed tech issue? And as we think about how we develop a university or an institution, any institution, we're often trying to integrate systems that go well beyond ed tech. So there might be a student portal, which is an administrative system, but you are deeply embedding the learning within that portal, or just timetable information, that sort of thing. So I think one of the key things here is when we talk about the platforms, we're actually got to be thinking about learning and teaching is only going to be a subset of all of the platforms that an organisation will try and bring together, ostensibly to help students be able to navigate. Here's your one spot that you start and you go here. So is it a learning and teaching ed tech issues? Yes-ish, but it's also just a subset of the larger organisational activities.
So this is one of the challenges that we have when we're going to be looking at our benchmarks is what question do we ask to make sure that we are assessing the right standard against the right thing? Is that actually something we do want to be including because the students can't even get into the classroom unless they've actually managed to get through these hurdles? So is that a place we want to play in as ACODE, or do we firmly say, you know what, that's actually not what we are looking for, but, you know, do we actually include that in the benchmarks? And so this is one of the questions I think to ask. So online, yeah.
Gordon's got his hand up there.
Yeah, thanks, Sheila. I hope everybody can hear me. So I think at our institution, we have a viewpoint that it's about trying to shrink the actual app footprint for the university because there are certainly far too many apps. I think there is also a balance between stagnating on that front in terms of standardization, and also wanting to be differentiated as well, because our university, like many other universities, wants to acquire apps or capabilities so that they are competing against other universities. The other thing that we've also talked about is actually having an immersive experience, which basically means that the apps actually kind of become one app. And now that's very difficult to do, because all providers want to differentiate themselves. They want to brand themselves. It also has support overheads as well, potentially, because then it becomes difficult for a user to identify what app they're actually in, so that you can't actually support them. So it's a balance between those things. So I think that part of it's to do with the amount of apps that we want to standardize and what we want to differentiate on. Yeah, so that's just my viewpoint.
Thanks, Gordon. Anyone else want to speak online?
Kate, I can provide a little bit of a summary. I think in essence, most of the online cohort is kind of saying, look, it's not just about the ed tech itself. It's actually about the layers around it, and Gordon's talked about that as well. But considering things all the way up to policy, you know, and then downwards, if you like, and onto the ground with course design and consistency. So students know what to expect is another sort of area as well. Yeah, we had one poor lady who was like, what keeps me up at 3 a.m? Well, it's the amount of bloody applications an academic is putting into a course right now, you know, and those are really serious implications. And again, related to awareness and professional development, of course, as well.
One of the things that keeps me awake at night is particularly in those universities that have significant online environments, is we have larger than usual numbers of absent fail or zero fail rates. And the question that I sometimes have is, what are those rates associated with? Is it because the students couldn't even get into the classroom, or they couldn't upload, or they had issues negotiating way too many systems and platforms, and it all got a bit too hard? And certainly we know that particularly for neurodivergent students, for example, actually it can just be, you know what, I'm just not even going there. I'm actually going to walk away because it's easy to do so. So again, questions to ask. So, and then the final scenario is person who is an amputee in both hands is required to give an on-campus presentation to class. And is this an education technology in learning and teaching consideration? And what considerations have you made in your institution that you know of that would support a student like that? So it could be me, and I could be giving this presentation like systems, trying to give a presentation to class. So, yeah, again, take a few minutes in your groups to have a think about this one. Or views, or Sheila, would you like to summarise?
Yeah, Kate, no worries at all. I think some of the things that were mentioned in the online group are things like reasonable adjustment plans. However, something like that, again, relies on that self, you know, nomination by that particular student. We also looked at specific IT requirements are a bit of an issue here as well, because at an institutional level, that's wrapped up in things like an EICP budget or an EIRP recurring budget, instead of a learning and teaching process. So an example of that is fleet machines, because the other thing we talked about were flexibility in our machines. That's got to be available. You know, are they enabling different types of functions? So touchscreen, running by a mouse, those sort of things as well. So multiple format presentations, and perhaps enablement via BYOD as well. So someone who's an amputee, for example, maybe using something, you know, that is operated by the mouth. Well, they probably have a specific machine for that. Can we connect it to our infrastructure is the real question there. And, you know, will we ever get this flexibility again in that sort of realm because of assessment security? So it's a pretty broad field.
Those who are trying to crack into Edurome and have spent the last 3 days trying to crack into Edurome, or with that or general, right? So thank you, Sheila. Yes, absolutely. And I think one of the key things that comes out of that actually is the student kind of ability to choose and the flexibility regarded with regard to the student being student-centered in the decision-making associated with how they want to participate. So in the online, in the room, any specific points that anyone would like to make with regard to this?
Hi, Mark Thompson, Manager, Student Disability Services, University of Auckland. I guess some of the consideration that we talked about was actually getting to the room. So noting it's an on-campus presentation, so opening doors may be an issue, as well as the issues that have been raised online around the technology that you use. So is some flexibility around changing the room, maybe moving it online to be able to use the technology that somebody is used to, adopting that human-centered approach that we should all do.
Right. Thank you. Anyway, yep.
So I'm one of the advisors at Accessibility Services at University of Waikato. So one of the things that we've started implementing this year in particular with newer students who have got high complex needs is study support plans. And so this is a plan that it's student focused, it's their plan, but one of the main sections is what I might need my lecturer to know. And so basically we write it with them, and it's basically telling the lecturer exactly what they need. So in this sort of instance, it might be that they have the option to record the lecture, the presentation in advance. It could also be that if it's a timed presentation, that they actually get extra time to accommodate for their own disability.
Yep, great. Thanks. Any final comments just before we do a little bit of a summary? Well, firstly, I would like to congratulate the University of Auckland, because as somebody who is often a carer or somebody who actually cannot get into and out of rooms, it is awesomely set up, because I've been noticing all of the push buttons on the way through, thinking, yeah, we would have no problem walking through the campus. So that is a great start. So you're right, just getting into the space and the technology associated to getting into the space. Yeah, is it learning education technology, or is it not? Or do we actually need to rethink our view of what is education technology in a very ubiquitous mode? You know, when we started with ACODE, and we've got ASCOT, we've got a range of organisations associated with education technology and computers in education. And, you know, we started when there was nothing, and then there were computers. Then there was computers and learning platforms, and then we moved on. So actually, do we need to possibly in the benchmarking reconceptualize actually the scope of what we're talking about, or do we actually as a group go, no, we're actually really comfortable to sit over here in the non-physical space, but we have started to move into the learning space piece because of where we went last. So that's some of the conversation. The second thing is something, and I'll be really interested in Darren Britton's perspective when we get to your presentation this afternoon or even now, is that, you know, we tend to homogenise disability, but, and this is something as someone who does research in disability, you know, and the idea that ethical requirement is required for people with disability, with the view that someone with disability has an intellectual impairment and therefore can't speak for themselves. You know, and so we've got people perhaps who actually do have an intellectual disability and need people to really consider that. But then there are others who actually don't. You know, people, and amputees are a really great example. There's absolutely nothing wrong with the cognitive space there, you know, headspace there. It is actually to do with, I just can't get into the room. I just need to be able to access the technology. So thinking about how we actually advocate for and represent and think about all of our students, and at the moment is it that we're going in institutions one size fits all, or how do we actually in our benchmarks consider the actual diversity of our students who need support differently? And then the final point, and it's a question that I will pose to everybody, is should students be asking for help? And how do we design spaces and places and environments where students actually don't need to ask for help because it is so ubiquitously inclusive or accessible that actually, you know, you walk in, it's voice activated, open doors, you know, but then obviously you may have people who can't speak. So you're never ever going to get 100% solution, but where you can possibly look at designing, how do you do that? And how do we actually incorporate that in a question that we're going to ask for benchmarking? So are there any final questions or comments that anyone would like us to make and actually park and make sure that we've included or captured in this discussion just as a general discussion point before I move on? So, yep.
Very much. Aileen here from Student Disability Services at Auckland. Just a sort of overall reflection of the really good discussion was we're talking a lot about learning and learning technologies and then about building design and compliance. And so it's just that sort of siloed, and universities are very siloed institutions, but accessibility, as the discussions have shown, is across all of it. So how do we actually bring that together in a benchmark? And Kathy, sitting next to me here, has done quite a cool thing called the equity catch-up. We'll call it the equity catch-up. I can't remember its real name. So, but she's brought in, you know, the property services from Auckland University and Steve and a bunch of other equity practitioners, and that's been really good. Just casual conversations and being like, oh, you know, there's this happening. Oh, I've got to think about that in my plans. Just a sort of way to bring a bit more collaboration between those silos.
So maybe the question then is, Ashley, yeah, and maybe the question then is, the benchmarking question is, how closely do across your institution do the different areas work to ensure an approach? So that might be something that we look at. And Ashley and Gordon.
Thanks, Kate. You can all hear me all right?
We can.
Great. I was looking at all of these questions and thinking, you know, I think most of us would think of, in our case, student equity and disability services and academic adjustment plans as being the answer, student support workers, that sort of thing. But it does depend on the goodwill of the academic, and it's often forthcoming. It is not always forthcoming. So I think a meta question would be, on top of these, how do we change university cultures so that it is unthinkable not to support that student? Just a provocation.
Yeah, lots of nodding in the room here. So thanks, Ashley. And Gordon.
I think this is really a balance between what's called enterprise technology versus learning technology. And I'll give you an example of that. Teams is an enterprise technology, but I don't think that it's fully matured in terms of a learning technology. I also find that, I mean, Curtin has got an absolutely amazing DAPE plan. We call it Disability Access Inclusion Plan. We've also had, you know, people leave the university, so that the momentum around accessibility generally becomes, it actually loses momentum, or it's like this is not my job. There's no advocacy, and sometimes it's an afterthought. So there's a balance of those sorts of things. I think that's just a confluence of just large-scale organisations trying to do lots of things, and just not focusing it. Ultimately, we should have all of these things just as a standard, straight up, and we've got to try and anticipate every single aspect that possibly can occur with regards to accessibility. It should just be woven into what we do and the applications that we acquire. So something that is not fit for purpose, and getting, you know, even just the technology, the learning technology that we basically acquire at universities, having to go through those due diligence checklists to make sure that it is being followed, so nothing does get in the gate and then becomes barrier.
Thank you very much, Gordon. So look, we are at time. We've got lots more great discussion to come. And just your final point, Gordon, with regard to standards, we do obviously feel that there's a gap that has actually been raised here with regard to, you know, and we will look through some of that, and will we come up with standards at the end possibly, but really looking forward to the next sessions. We have a 15 for our online, we've got a 15-minute break, and we're back at 1:30 for or Kathy's session?
hour.
On the half hour. So we look forward to seeing you all back then, and thanks everybody for participating.
Hi, this is Kathy. Okay. So the TEC requires us to produce these investment plans. Each plan also reports on progress, as well as laying out how we plan to use the resources we're requesting over the next 3 years. And it runs on a 3-year cycle. Having said that, the kids on the naughty step can be asked to submit another plan in a year or 2 years' time if the TEC is not satisfied with their 3-year plan. And a major component of that investment plan is something called the Learner Success Plan. And as of 3 years ago, the investment plan also needed to include a disability action plan. And this is kind of where I come in and the people that I work closely with. So just to zoom back out again for a second, learner success plans include initiatives for improving success, participation and access of learners in need. And learners in need are loosely defined this way by our government. This has actually just recently changed in the Gazette that came out at the beginning of March. So you hopefully can see this, but in case you can't, the list is low socioeconomic backgrounds, low prior achievement, disabled learners, neurodiverse learners, Māori learners and Pacific learners. And so the Disability Action Plan is specific to disabled learners and neurodiverse learners. In September 2021, the TEC introduced mandatory disability action plans for all organisations that receive more than $5 million from TEC. So it's not all 700, that would be unworkable, but for anything that is of a certain size. And this was part of the government's efforts at the time to ensure that tertiary providers met their responsibilities under the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. So that was the background driver for the government to mandate this. So that meant that providers, if you account for a tiny stop over Christmas, have roughly 6 months to come up with their first disability action plan to get them submitted by mid-2022. Since then, we've reported annually, and we'll be submitting our second 3-year plans in the middle of this year. So just that's the runway, I hope, into what we're going to talk about. And in the next few minutes, I'm just going to share how we've organised ourselves to deliver on our disability action plan, what some of the key challenges were along the way, and what would have helped us in the process so far. So the good news is, I think we're a little bit fortunate here at Waipapa Taumata Rau, is that we had a bit of momentum coming into this. So even though it felt like quite a short timeline for our first one, we weren't caught flat-footed. Because we already had a disability program in place, which had 3 work streams, which related to culture and the work-study environment, communications and digital accessibility, and physical and built environment accessibility. And this program of work really involved gathering the perspectives and priorities of students and staff within the university who experience disability and partnering across several parts of the organisation. And a key element of this work was the acceleration of technology-enhanced learning, as well as improvements in inclusivity and accessibility of online learning and teaching. All of that, of course, as you'll be well aware, came into very sharp focus during the response to the COVID-19 pandemic in the final year of this program. Another key element of the work that I think helped us was the improvement in the collection and reporting of data on students and staff who disclose disability to us. As you can see, that the number and percentage of students who tell us they experience disability has steadily risen since we improved our data collection processes in 2017. I'm sure this trend is something you're seeing in all of your organisations as well. And of course, we can't know the difference between greater disclosure or greater numbers of people with disability, and it doesn't really matter in a sense. Either way, between our disabled learners, whom you see here, plus our disabled staff, we have well over 5,000 people at the university who experience disability. That number often comes as a surprise to some of our senior leaders. So as we got underway with our work, we needed to, we actually took a bottom-up approach, right? We had the disability program, which was informed by the community, and we took a fairly bottom-up approach, inviting staff and student communities to tell us, what they thought, yeah, thanks, Justin. I think it's cool too, to tell us what they thought should be in a plan. And this just surfaced a wide range of ongoing issues. Despite the good work that had already been undertaken and was in progress, there was still obviously plenty more for us to be doing and thinking about. And this resulted in a set of over 100 initial tasks. Each task was mapped onto the portfolios and strategic priorities provided in Tamata Teite. That's the colour on the right there. And this is the university's 10-year strategic plan. So we carefully looked at what we were wanting to achieve around disability and how that related to the university's overall plan and strategy. Each task of those 100 tasks was also assigned an impact score reflecting its importance to the community. And a traffic light system was also used to code each task according to a gap analysis. So how far away were we from where the community was telling us we needed to be? Now, as you can imagine, this analysis created a very large and complex data set. I see Mark smiling because it was quite overwhelming at times, isn't it? And to be perfectly frank, I'm not sure that if we were starting from scratch, we'd go about it in exactly the same way. We've probably learned some lessons from that process. Nonetheless, getting to this point produced one of our first key challenges, which was simply narrowing it down. Just narrowing it down, recognising, of course, we can't do everything. So we had this big analysis. We needed to synthesise and refine our ideas as much as possible so that we could develop some really concrete deliverables with expected timeframes for completion. And this really, for us, I think, crystallised the plan. And it immediately created a new challenge, which was managing expectations. When you consult widely, as you should, with the communities involved, and scoop up all of the feedback and ideas that you can, this can create an expectation that everything will be acted upon. So a really important part of refining our plan was communicating with key interested parties so they understood the rationale for the decisions we were making. Maintaining the trust of our students and staff was essential as we went through the process of deprioritising or setting aside entirely some of the things that were on the wish list. So that was not straightforward. And again, if I had my time again, there were things I would probably do better here. Related to trust, we needed to make sure that we were accountable to these key communities. So what we did, which continues to work really well for us, was put together a reference group. And we did that by putting out a call for expressions of interest to the entire student and staff community. We weren't just going to shoulder tap people we knew about who might be interested. We created an open call for expressions for interest. And this resulted in a group that has over 20 members in it. And it's comprised of people with lived experience and is very carefully balanced in terms of students and staff, undergraduates and postgraduates, professional and academic staff, as well as STEM and cable disciplines. So we've really thought about it to make sure that we've got that full range of perspectives in the room. It's co-chaired by an academic and a professional staff member and meets about 4 or 5 times a year with meeting support from the PBC equity team. So that accountability is really crucial. Basically, they are our critic and conscience. They keep us honest and tell us what's really going on out there. So we had the plan, and we had a group. This group receives our progress reports on a regular basis. And we collaborate with this group on really early drafts of policies, procedures, guidelines, as well as web content and resources. It's a forum, it's a very important forum where members can ask us literally anything, raise all their concerns, make all their suggestions, and genuinely influence the work of the university. I think this is one of the most important ways in which we honour the principle of nothing about us without us. This is where it happens. So I think anyone who's moving into a space of a big disability action plan, this requires a lot of thought and investment up front to do it well. So next we just really had to organise our plan, right? We've narrowed it down, we've crystallised it out. We had to get organised in a conceptually sensible way. To do this, we organised our plan into 5 work streams. So you can see them listed here, and the first one, student experience, relates basically to all of our students' interactions with the university, on campus and online, and the quality and the success of those interactions. This is where our student disability service, led by Mark and Ailey here, just plays a vital role, and where our digital and built environments also come into play. Workstream 2 is learning and teaching, and I'm just going to provide a little more detail on that in a second. Workstream 3 is really interesting, to your earlier point, Justin, online, because there was no requirement from TEC for providers to consider disabled staff at all. And we chose to include a work stream relating to staff because obviously, and also many of our students are in fact on staff. The line's actually very blurry, and we just refused to kind of buy into that division. And this work stream also relates to building staff knowledge and capability and the ways they support their disabled learners. So we think that work stream, while not required, is absolutely essential. Work streams 4 and 5 are kind of the boring ones. Those are my ones. They relate to the organisation-wide activities and systems and policies, and they meet the TEC requirements for clear leadership and governance of the overall plan. So that's why they're in place. And I think it's all of these work streams together that contribute to the accessibility of our digital, built and physical environments and the extent of inclusion and belonging experienced by our disabled learners. So I said I'd just say a little bit more about Workstream 2, Learning and Teaching. It has 4 strategy elements. I'll just leave them up there, I won't go through them. And what these strategy elements do is they outline the approach we're taking. All right, so it's not a deliverable, this is our approach to achieving our vision. And under each of these elements, which I'm not showing you, but it's all in there somewhere, under each of these elements are deliverables with milestones and clear timelines. So we have concrete plans to work with. Once a deliverable is achieved, we can replace it with a new initiative that supports that element of our strategy. Right, so those strategy elements could have all sorts of different initiatives functioning in underneath them. So in this way, the strategy elements are actually fairly perennial, and they're operationalised by a rolling series of initiatives that can be adapted and adjusted as needed. That seems to be working for us. So our next challenge was leadership. We had to pitch that at the correct level of the organisation. And so you can see here AD stands for Associate Director, anywhere you see that. So to us, it felt obvious who the appropriate role holders were to be the accountable senior leader for each work stream. This is sort of organised, it reflects or maps onto our own organisational structure. So it wasn't difficult to identify the right people. The challenge really initially was in helping each person understand what their responsibilities were and that they weren't necessarily new responsibilities. It's stuff that whether they kind of had it at top of mind or not was already in their portfolio. Here we're pulling it out and putting it in one place and making it visible for them and for everybody else. So working across the organisation this way is really challenging. I think we've already talked, I think Ailey brought it up, how siloed things can be inside universities. The complex universities are organised vertically. They're really not organised horizontally at all. So it did take some time and a lot of relationship building to bring these role holders to a place of comfortable understanding about what was being asked of them and how their work related to everybody else's work and the overall big picture. So just that took time, is how I put that. The next challenge was one of governance. Ensuring the plan had actually really experienced governance from the university's most senior leaders was really important and a TEC requirement. No, if it hasn't got buy-in from the top, it's not really going to get traction. To make sure that the overall plan is actually really well aligned with the university's operational goals and strategy, taumata teite, that I showed you before. So what we chose to do was use a relatively new but already existing governance structure called the University Equity Leadership Committee, which is chaired by the Vice-Chancellor and actually reports directly to the University Council. So it is a subcommittee of council. And so that's the highest level we could get, basically, for something like this. And it provides DEI leadership for the entire university. And it's really vital for the success of the Disability Action Plan that it's got leaders at this level who are responsible for the governance of everything that we're doing. So our next really significant challenge, once we had all these pieces in place, was just keeping track of it all. Honestly, keeping track of it all. It's just really tough across 5 complicated work streams being led by different people. And we very quickly worked out that Excel was not going to cut it. Oh, no. So we moved to Cascade, which you may have heard about, you might already be using in your organisation. Some of the benefits we've experienced with it are that it is a secure and easy way for us to track the progress of our own, for each work stream owner to track their own work stream, but also see the progress of other work streams. Cascade is an award-winning strategy execution platform, right? So these people know what they're doing, and the customer support we've had is excellent. They're not paying me to say this. So we find that everyone being able to see all the other work streams does help with sharing of communication and keeping everybody on track. We've set up our strategy elements with our deliverables and our milestones. We can track them with really clear visualizations. We get a prompt every month to update our work stream. So we just look through and go, where am I up to? What are the roadblocks? Oh yeah, I've advanced that on. That's been done right. That's the next thing, etc. And we can get a snapshot report out of that at any time. So we can report at any point in time. This is where we're up to in our progress. So there's a person in the PVC equity team tasked with coordinating all of that now. So that is really helping us just project manage our way through. And it does give easy reporting. Speaking of reporting, the last challenge that I'll just touch on here is quite a big one, which is how do we know anything's working? So thanks to Cascade, we can track and report on our progress towards specific goals and objectives, but one of the very, sort of going back to the beginning, one of the very early challenges we had was in working out the overarching success indicators for the whole disability action plan. So each deliverable, we know when we're done, it's all written in concrete terms, but how do we know that the plan in aggregate is making a difference? So this is where I think it would have been quite helpful for us, for the whole sector, to have had a bit more guidance around that. So that we could sort of have an agreed thing that we were all working towards, and we could compare ourselves to bench or to peer organisations. But this was the first time that TEC had required disability action plans, and so providers with some guidance, but ultimately more or less left to our own devices to figure out how, what will be our success indicators. So, okay, these are now, out of date probably, but this is what we came up with on our first attempt. And I think Simon mentioned some of this when he was speaking, and I'm not going to ask you to read through all of that, but you can see that just in general, we have 6 success indicators, and the success indicators generally relate to parity between disabled and non-disabled learners across measures of experience and achievement. And we also expect the level of participation by disabled students and staff to be stable or grow over time. We do not want to see it going backwards. And so far, we are tracking, as we'd hoped, for participation, but there remains a lack of parity in experience and achievement, which will come as no surprise to any of you. We think this partly relates back to the pandemic, because there were some significant gaps widened at that time. They aren't closing up again, but it is taking time to get there, which is encouraging. It's just, obviously, it's a long-term project. So we expect these to change slowly over time. So, in the last little bit, what has been really helpful to us? Well, the TEC released a toolkit that was actually particularly helpful in the process of prioritising our tasks and developing our deliverables. There are also sections in there that provide quite useful best practice guidelines for our workstream owners or leaders. And the toolkit is a living document. It's evolving and being updated. So it's available on this website, Achieve. Anyone can go and have a look at it, and it might be quite helpful for others to have a think about what advice have you got for us around putting together a big plan like this. I think establishing the reference group as early as possible was very helpful, because they gave us really sound advice and a good sense of direction. whenever we were unsure how to prioritise tasks and initiatives. And they kept us quite focused on large-scale projects, such as improving accessibility of our learning and teaching materials for the benefit of all learners, actually. So it kept us thinking big. We did benefit from quite strong institutional support and good buy-in from all workstream leaders that continues to build over time. And finally, we have the benefit of good quality data from a range of institutional sources. And they include UDOIT audits of our campus courses, and Steve's team has worked really hard on leading that out. We're excited to be able to get into a reporting cycle now with that. We have good data on disabled learner participation and success. We also have qualitative data from our learning and teaching survey, which can be segmented into disabled and non-disabled learners and thematically analysed. So we're actually in quite a good position now to be able to track our progress as well as anticipate future needs. So what do we need? What would be good? A joined-up approach across the sector would be great. At the moment, recording will stop in 2 minutes. I'm not going to panic. Somebody else is going to manage that. Cool. So a joined-up approach would be great. If you imagine the blue oval in the middle, that's the TEC, right? So at the moment, we don't know if the coloured dots are all tertiary providers. We just don't know how anybody else is doing. What are they thinking about? How are they solving the challenges that we've probably got too? So we can read their disability action plans, so they're publicly available, but we're working on a range of things in a range of ways with different success indicators. So it's actually quite hard to know whether we're keeping up with our peer institutions. There is informal information sharing between organisations, and people are usually really generous with this. So it's not a problem with the people, it's a problem with the system that we're in. TEC staff have also shared good practices that they observe, which is great. Though I will just say, cuts to the public service workforce mean that there are now far fewer people involved in DAPs within the TEC. So at the moment, the TEC provides guidance. Each provider interprets this guidance, comes up with their own plan and does their best. A potentially useful alternative would look a bit more like this, where the TEC or another body, don't know, supports providers to work together to share best practices and calibrate against each other to develop a shared understanding of sector-wide standards and expectations. That's the dream. That would be so good. All right, so conclusions. Fortune favours the prepared. So organisations that plan and prepare for opportunities or new obligations, like, we need a disability action plan in 6 months, they're much more likely to succeed when those arise. We're in a good position to prepare a fairly mature plan in the first round because of the previous work that others have been doing. I would quickly put together a reference group, organise into streams of senior leaders and arrange for good governance. It took us a bit longer to set up effective project management, but I think we're in a good position now. Each provider, I think, has tended to work in isolation, as I just said, which means we're just not fully benefiting as a sector from our combined learning and experience. And each provider's done a lot of internal work to get up and running. And there's a growing readiness, I think, for a more outward-looking approach. We've sort of got our house in some sort of order, and we're ready to look up and out. And work well with the neighbours. So things like clear standards and benchmarks, I think, would really help here our sector coalesce around this work and really strengthen our plans collectively. How are we for time, Steve?
We've got time for maybe one question.
Okay, I'm going to stop there. I'm going to stop there. I had a little coda because I was looking at the draft, 10-point benchmark, that Zoe sent around last night, and I can't help it because, of my role. I just went straight into how are we doing? So do you want to have a quick look at that? Okay, sorry. Thank you. Our Presidente says it's okay. Okay, so the little coda, these are the draft benchmark statements, and the status is my best off-the-cuff evaluation of how's Waipapa Tamatarau doing. A lot of it in progress. For other things, yes, asterisks, sometimes maybe it's going to be inconsistent. And for the next few, am I going the right way? Queries where, when I read this, I wasn't sure what the word address means. When I think about Tamata Teite, which is the University Strategic Plan, I don't know what address means. So, as you're thinking about the language you want to use, I don't know what that means yet. sorry, this is the earliest possible feedback, isn't it? You kind of ask, did you ask? You didn't ask, and I'm giving it to you anyway. And, you know, you can see again, yup, star, sort of. It's a moving target. We keep building and renovating, which means things are always changing. In progress, not sure. What do you mean by resourced? I don't know, you know, because you could spend the absolute minimum and say, yeah, resource done. Right, resource to what extent? Because you can also spend an infinite amount of resource. So what's appropriate? What's the range that we're after? So, you know, so very early end user feedback as somebody that would be responding to a document like this, these are the things that are churning in my head. And it's difficult because, you know, you can see I can't just say a concrete yes to almost anything because everything's always in motion. Everything's always in motion. So, so that's my tiny coda, and thank you for indulging me. That's a bit naughty, sneaking it on the end, but that's what I have for you. And rest your eyes on this while you think about any burning question or comment you'd like to make.
I was interested in whether through the work that you were doing, you were looking at any sort of intersectionality. So in the Learner Success Plan, it talks about a number of different groups, but the Disability Action Plan, perhaps, in terms of how you mentioned it, doesn't. And I think it currently appears to be like an area that's been missed.
Oh, I couldn't agree more. It's really frustrating, right? So it's still not even, it's still not clear to me now how we have a learner success plan around all those groups, and then this other thing around disabled learners and where all the connection points are. It's really frustrating that we can't just think about everybody together. But at the same time, I'm really glad that we have a whole separate focus on disability. That's right in my mind. So what I haven't been able to share with you is that the Disability Action Plan, ours and I'm sure many others in yours, also thinks about other TSC priority learner groups. That's outdated language now, Māori and Pacific in particular. So thinking about those intersections and ensuring they're visible, that's been part of it. But it becomes an infinite problem, doesn't it? Pretty quickly. Yeah. So you have to choose a perspective at some point to make it coherent. Yeah. Okay. Thank you so much for your attention. I really enjoyed listening on stage. Yeah.
All right. Thank you, everybody, and thank you, Kathy, and thank you, Kate, for your presentations. And look, it fits perfectly into what I'd like to talk about today, and that is from some perspectives and reflections from the Australian Disability Clearinghouse on education and training. Very unique. We'll get into that. I'm probably going to ask more questions than answers, but I think that's what these conferences are getting people together for, so that we can plan ideally for a better future and a collaborative future, much as Kathy was pointing out as well. So first off, I'd just like to acknowledge, and in the spirit of reconciliation in Australia, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea and community. And I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. And I extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and other First Nations people here from Australia, New Zealand and beyond, joining us for this presentation today. While virtually connected, we are geographically dispersed, and I would like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation here in Victoria, where I am presenting from, and the Palawa Pakana people of Lotruwita, which is Tasmanian Aboriginal land that hosts ADSET. So welcome and kia ora, everybody. So a bit about this presentation. I'd like to share some of my perspectives and reflections from ADSET and my 20 years working on inclusive resource development, 20 plus years, I'm getting too old now, and working with students with disability and disability practitioners, and also working with professional and academic staff in trying to minimise access barriers, which is largely what we're talking about today, and trying to get some standards to help reduce those into the future. So 3 points that I'd like to discuss, or 3 main points, would be: what can history tell us so far? Are these new problems or not? What can we do and plan for? And of course, the big question of the moment, teaching and learning in the age of generative AI. So I'll start with what can history tell us? And you'll see on screen, I have a picture of a time machine, a DeLorean from Back to the Future. Of course, I could have chosen possibly a TARDIS for those that are Doctor Who fans, or a hot tub, hot tub time machine or whatever that movie was. But I deliberately picked a DeLorean. It's one that I've used in a few different scenarios, just so purely I can have some people yell out, you build a DeLorean out of a time machine, or you build a time machine out of a DeLorean, I should say. So let's cast our mind back, which is something we don't do often enough, I think, to look at what can history tell us when we start talking about accessibility standards and inclusive education. So let's go back 20 and a bit years, 2004. 1 year prior to the Disability Standards for Education coming out, which was 20 years ago this year, 2025. If we look at just some of the things that were happening around that time, we were just starting to get into some online, slightly some blended learning, possibly, but we were all dipping our toes into that space. Microsoft MSN was the most popular brand on the World Wide Web. It was the most visited website. Google at that stage was the 5th ranked search engine, and it ranked well below Yahoo and AOL, and was considered weird in comparison to the other search engines that were monopolizing the internet at that stage. Time magazine had touted Friendster.com as one of the best websites of the year, and one to keep an eye on, as it would dominate the space. MySpace, which had launched just a year before, late the year before, had an ambitious plan to become the most dominant social network. This was the big first kind of foray into social networking, and it was expected to remain that way and be the leader in that. Coupled with that, Facebook had just been launched late the year before, and it was just being trialed at that stage. So perfect. We all know what the future is going to be based purely on what was happening at the time, and we made judgments about those things. So fast forward almost 10 years, almost a decade. What were the challenges we were still facing at that stage in terms of teaching and learning and educational technologies, and how we were delivering education? I did a presentation with then Associate Professor of DVC. We had Claire Mackin, which some of you may know, who was our a DVC for Future Learning, or Learning Futures, I think it was. And we still had all these challenges. We still had emerging technologies. Some of them were solving existing issues, and some of them were creating new issues. I recall back to my first foray into accessible formats, and it was primarily converting from reading packs, that might have had 15, possibly 20 readings in there for students, and that was the bulk of what we're expecting students to get through, and the resources that would be required. And they had policies and guidelines around them, etc. They had to be in and developed, a couple of months beforehand, so that they go off to the printer and be printed and bound and available in the bookshops for students to get. So we had systems and processes in place to ensure everybody had access in time for those things. Technologies have since moved on. We don't have reading packs much anymore, although it does come up now and then when we may be supporting an incarcerated student that can't use the online, can't use the internet, and we suddenly think, how do we deliver these things? We can go back to reading packs, believe it or not. As simple as they are, they can work. Other challenges were interoperability between our various systems and platforms competing, adoptions of standards. Another discussion for today. What standards? What are we trying to adopt? And they were still in flux then as well, with the onset of the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. There was discussion around the future, holding that input and output, and we won't be using a mouse by 2020. Some had predicted, our interfaces would change, the way staff and students would be operating with the systems. I personally still have not forgiven Beyond 2000 TV show that was on back in the 80s that promised we would all have hover cars by the year 2000. So again, we can't predict the future. yeah, so multimodal platforms, different delivery systems, which one's the best, which one should we be using? And we all know our institutions keep changing those processes and going for the next big thing or the next thing that will deliver what we need for our students. Distributed authors, contents and systems. There was an issue then, still I think an issue now. And of course the age-old connectivity, credentials, privacy, copyright, etc., etc. So not much I think had changed, except we were much more in a digital environment. The problems just transformed, I think, or the issues transformed into now digital challenges. So what can history tell us in that respect? So we all know the future is hard to predict, and making assumptions makes an ass out of you and me, as the saying goes. If we could predict the future, we would have all bought stocks in Microsoft and Facebook, and possibly Google as well. The 5th ranking one, they were very cheap back then. I think you could get shares for well under $1. Change comes slowly. Anybody tells you they can change an institution on a dime is not aware of how big our institutions are, unfortunately. I had a DVC at one point describe institutions as a massive big oil tanker, that if you ever tried to slow one of those down, it takes a long time and it moves incrementally. You can't change things quickly. You almost need to do things in parallel while that's there until they're ready to catch up. Our students and their expectations are certainly changing, and we've heard that today, and the changing expectations of staff as well. Students are coming in with different levels of preparation. We've got an increasing number of diverse students coming in, and the data is showing that, particularly in Australia as well. The number of students, and that was shown earlier, has more or less doubled. Students with registering with the Disability Service has doubled since about 2019. And that goes towards policies and plans for getting more students from secondary school and post-secondary into higher education and into vocational education and training. But we're still not doing enough in that respect as well. We also know teaching and learning will continue to change as we adapt those systems, as we have less staff, we have more funding requirements and crunch, we have different workload systems than we certainly had 10, 20 years ago. Now, staff are expected to do more. A common thing is, where do you want me to put this in my inbox, and after what other priorities do I have to do? The age-old question. Students want consistency. This is something we've been told year after year after year after year in student feedback surveys, as we introduce more and more and more systems and ways for students to interact with things. There's a point where students just want consistency, particularly between subjects. Students aren't necessarily studying just one subject or in one discipline, and needing to navigate various systems and various ways that those systems are constructed. How a subject or a unit is created in one discipline is probably completely different, and even using a different vocabulary in the next one. What is a prescribed reading versus a primary reading versus a necessary reading, and where do we find those things? Remember, a student gave us some feedback, and it was quite common when we then asked the question in future years, that it was week 5 by the time the student learned that the LMS was also the learning management system, which was also Moodle. They just hadn't touched anything for 5 weeks with this thing Moodle, because nobody had told them that was the same thing they were already using. And they thought, everyone else is using Moodle, I just need to go and find out what that is. And I'm feeling a bit left behind some other students. So, consistency and language as well can certainly help. And institutions are still largely operating, Kathy touched on this, in a retrofit model. We're making accommodations, and that's largely around the disability standards for education as well. We spend a lot of time, a lot of money retrofitting and making accommodations. So if we know some of these things from history, then what can we do and what can we plan for? And we've heard some of those already today. So the standards and the culture that we adopt, how do we deliver these new standards? Who's responsible for those standards that was there? And how do we bring about that change in culture? Because really that's what it is, which are changing big institutions, and that leads into we need to acknowledge that accessibility benefits everybody. This isn't for a few students with a disability or a large minority of students, if we look at the numbers that are there, that it benefits everybody. And also, and it was good to hear Kathy say, that everybody's also responsible for it. We need to have embedded responsibility. Everybody needs to get on board and be responsible for it. We need to measure it, etc. Accessible ICT procurement is one of those. Are the tools that we're getting in to our institutions, are they fit for purpose? Are they accessible? And in some cases, they are accessible. Just all the accessibility options are turned off by default. That's been pretty much standard, and it's been standard in a lot of Microsoft systems until COVID kind of came along. And there's probably nodding, I would hope, in the room from some that even getting automatic transcripts turned on, even though they were automatic transcripts, turning them on, they were not on by default. In the systems that we had in Teams or even in Zoom. Those had to be worked in with contracts with the vendors to get those things turned on. So while some of the tools have accessibility options built in and inclusive options, they're not on by default. And we know once a system's implemented or a new tool's implemented, it's very hard to get that to change on a dime. Again, big oil tanker, got to go through a change process. What's it going to affect? And I've heard too often we'll do that during the next upgrade. We'll put it on the table for the next upgrade, and it just doesn't get in there on the next upgrade, or the next upgrade introduces new problems because we haven't looked at what we've already done well that's in there. So we'll get to that point in a moment. And I hear more often than not, particularly since COVID, I suppose, it's increasing. We know that along with the student numbers, and that is this notion that every student now has an access plan. Well, there's more students with access plans, certainly. But the question I would then pose, if every student then has an access plan, then is our current teaching and the methods that we're delivering it in fit for purpose? If we have to change it for so many students or accommodate so many students, then what are we delivering in the first place, and how are we delivering it? That leads into, obviously, universal design for learning. It's not a fix for everything. It's a plan moving forward. It's a build on. It's a one at a time approach. We can't fix everything, and expecting to make everything 100% accessible is ridiculous. And you'll just end up with burnout. But how do we proactively design based on our student cohorts that we've got, that we know we're going to get on? How do we plus one, as it's known? How do we add inclusiveness into the next thing that we're doing? How do we retrofit? What's the biggest barrier we can get rid of right now? And it may be one that's not the biggest on everybody's agenda, but it's one that has high impact, but a low staff capacity to be able to go and change those things. We need to clearly recognize what we're already doing and what's already worked well. A lot of things, these challenges aren't new. A lot of them have been solved. They've been solved by other organizations as well in different ways, in different respects. There is no one model fits all, but we definitely need, and I was glad to see Kathy say, collaboration across the sector. We need to know what's working well. We need to be able to grab that, see how does that fit within our institution, with our structures, our funding models, our staffing capacity and needs, and how can we adapt and build on that, what's already working, and stop doing the things that aren't working rather than waiting for those to be fixed down the track. We need to recognize and amplify good practice and reward staff. We need it to be seen as an expectation eventually that we do this work. We recognize when it's done well, we amplify it, we celebrate it, and we reward staff. How many institutions have improving accessibility and inclusion within subjects within unit design as part of staff promotion? If it's not in the promotion matrix, then why would I spend my time doing it? And if it's not part of my workload plan to spend time on this, then it adds to that inbox, and it's after all the other things that are priority compliance things I have to do. And we need to obviously include people with lived experience of disability in all facets of those aspects of what we plan, from governance down. Lived experience has perspectives that those without that can certainly help, and it can help for everybody, as we're saying. So everybody benefits from that. So we get to the third part, teaching and learning and AI. AI is here to stay, as some are certainly saying. Get on board or get out of the way, maybe not. But it's here for staff and for students as well. How much time have we given staff to adapt to these tools, or training have we given staff, or are we still caught largely in the and I'll get to this a bit later, AI versus AI, academic integrity versus artificial intelligence, which has sucked most of the oxygen out of the discussion. That's slowly changing now. But again, we don't have any even standardized, largely, means of approaching that. There's a lot of that still being sent out to individual, unit or subject coordinators, or those responsible, to decide how and if it's used within their subject. So again, that consistency for students is a real issue. Case in point, I've heard too many stories recently of students that have been using assistive technology, and most assistive technology, or most AI is also can be considered assistive technology for students with a disability, have been told they can't use some of their assistive tech that they've been using for years because it now has AI in it. So tech that's got them through to third year, in the case of one student, was then denied access to using that, and they couldn't complete their studies. And they had to try a different set of units and repeat basically their third year of study, just from saying you can't use this tool, even though the AI wasn't writing anything for them. It wasn't doing that. It was just, it's got AI in it. You can't use it. So disappointing, but lessons to be learned. Look, the rise of tools, certainly with AI for personalized learning, and that's been touched on, and for that content consumption. We're getting, I think, more into that elusive space, where the content is king, but how it's delivered, and the means that that's delivered, whether that's visually, whether that's via audio, whether it's tactile, it could be a whole range of things, will be separate from the content. We have our staff spend a lot of time putting content in and making it look pretty, where we think we have control, or we're making it look engaging by adding in some color and adding in some images and adding in some other bits and pieces. Some of the tools mean we won't have to do some of that down the track. And the way that we can quickly change some of that content into different formats, into different means of delivery using AI, will be a windfall for staff, to help them, move things from one format to another, help engage students in multiple ways, which, given time restrictions on staff that are there, or the availability of time for staff, some of that's just not possible. So telling staff to go and be more flexible and to add in, multiple means of engagement and of assessment and those kind of things is really difficult, unless you're prepared to spend your weekend doing it, not being paid, as I often hear. It's there. Also, and this has been touched on, what can we learn from students? What are they already using? What's the technology that they're engaged with? And it's not one bit of technology, it's multiple pieces of technology for them to learn how and when and where they want to learn. What they might use on public transport while they're coming to an institution might be different than how they then use their laptop when they're at the university, versus how they use their computer when they're at home. All completely different, with different tools that are in there. So the distinction between a student using some technology that is a student that may be registered with a disability, versus just every other student that's there, and our neurodiverse, student cohort, is completely different. And some of these tools are benefiting both. I think of Google Notebook LM and some tools like that. AI and technology enhanced learning, again, I suppose, what are our expectations? And are we explicit with those as well? Again, that AI versus AI, academic integrity versus, artificial intelligence. Are we explicit? Are we informing students and staff about how to use those? Are we giving staff, standardized statements that they can use in assessments, in those things? And what are, again, are we sticking to those intended learning outcomes and the integrity of the course that's there? And students, a lot of students, particularly, and I've heard from many students with disability, that are fearful of using AI because, again, their lecturers have informed them that AI is bad and AI means academic integrity. So students don't even want to touch the tool, even though it could be of great use to them in terms of them reflective practice, quizzing them, helping them break down complex information, for those that may not have some of the prior learning experience that we would be expecting. And of course, funding. How is all of this possible? It would be nice in a real world. We are all in complex funding times. And one thing that I often reflect on, we have generally two in Australia, two big pools of funding within our institutions. I wouldn't say pools, but there's money for teaching and learning and there's money for student support. A lot of this sits somewhere in between both worlds. We almost need a third pool of funding that can help teaching and learning with this and also help with the student support that helps everybody get on board in the best way, because it is everybody's responsibility. So I've got a few minutes left there, so I might just throw it open to some questions, some thoughts as well. I'd be interested in people's thoughts and certainly some ideas that people may have.
Hi, everyone. Darren, this is a curly one, but I'm curious about what you think and what the hive mind in the room might think. How are we going to be able to retain any kind of accessibility in assessments when the hammer drops up about assessment security, as the hammer is currently dropping about assessment security? So if we have to make everything a Viva or we have to make everything an exam, what are we going to do?
Yeah, look, it's the curly question, isn't it? And I think it's a work in progress. That's there. How do we get the best out of the tools that we've got? And again, what have we done in the past? Post-COVID, the pendulum has swung very far, particularly on the East Coast in Australia, where there was lots of lockdowns. We had lots of trust in students. We kept exams open for 24 hours because we know not everybody could get online at the same time, with everybody needing to be online. We had a whole range of things. To some degree, and at some institutions, that swung completely the opposite way to how those exams are now proctored and the online ones. And you need multiple cameras, and you need to have your phone visible, and you need to have etc. And AI, funnily enough, is being used to check if it believes students are cheating, and they're getting flagged and sent out and notifying students that we think this has happened without any human intervention sitting in there as well.
For things that are associated with, say, autism or something.
Yeah. It's, somebody's talking to themselves. Well, we picture you were talking to somebody else that was in there, or cases I've heard of because the student looked off screen. They must have been looking at something else. How often do we think of things and we look up, or we look, to the left or the right or somewhere else? We're not sitting there just glued to a screen for an exam. Through to just even some of those considerations, slightly digress, with exams. And I had one academic saying, I've got so many adjustments for extra time that I've got for this exam for students needing an extra half an hour to an hour. And we need people in the room, and we need this, and it's problematic. And the question was then posed back, well, why not just give everybody an extra half an hour? If you finish in time, great. If you need the extra time, it's there. Everybody's got it. It's not something that's unique that you need to cater for if you're catering for everybody. And it was like, why haven't we always been doing that then? Why does it need to be a 2-hour exam? Why do we need to know what they can spit out in 2 or 3 hours within that? Does it make a difference if we're giving everybody an extra half an hour in that time, even though the expectation is we're expecting people to probably get it done within X time? Yeah, look, I would say watch this space. And I think as we have more of the tools, particularly with some of the AI that's coming in-house and that's protecting some of that data security, our systems won't, during exams won't go out beyond, our current networks and things like that, where we're looking to, I wouldn't say block control, we're locking them down for certain conditions. But age-old question, are exams the best way to test people and test understanding and learning? So there's lots to unpack there, I think.
Who wants to ask one follow-up question? I'll make a metaphor. A few years ago, I had to feed a large group in our family, about 15 different people. And I thought, I'll just make chicken salads. I had to make 12 different chicken salads to accommodate all of the personal needs and preferences. And okay, so I was an idiot. I should have put the ingredients for the salads on the table and asked 15 people to make their own salad, because then they'd get what they wanted. My goal was that everybody got fed and was happy with the food. Academics have lost sight of, in many cases, what's the objective here? The objective here is not purity of assessment integrity. The objective is, are people learning? How do we know that's happening? Are we part of that process and enabling it?
Exactly. And it's easy to overlook with the time pressures that we've added, to staff. And the common one we hear is, I don't have time to make those adjustments, or this is an extra time I'll need to find. That's in there. But as you said, retrofitting and the time that's then taken to retrofit things to help accommodate just costs us money. Standards, building things that are more flexible, is also a sustainability issue. It's sustainability of curriculum. It's sustainability in putting it into new and different systems as they come along, because we've built to standards. If something needs to be fixed or expanded on, we can do that more easily if it's built to standards in the first place. So yeah, thank you. I'll just leave you with this slide. Thank you, everybody. For more information on some of this, please visit the ADSET website, and also a blatant plug for the ADSET podcast called I Lotta Things, which is the inclusive learning opportunities through AI, where we look at that intersection between universal design for learning, accessibility, and AI and generative AI. How that's being used. So thank you, everybody, and enjoy the rest of the conference.
The process that we talk about, so benchmarking is a big tent. Benchmarking comes from a guy called Robert Camp, who was doing some work way back, looking at Xerox, among other places. And the point of benchmarking is transferring good ideas from one organisation to another organisation. That's really why we do it. And it's really important to remember that, because the point of good benchmarking isn't predicated on the idea that there is some idealised state that we're all trying to find. So the context of things that you can learn from each other predicated on the fact that someone is more perfect and therefore you want to be that more perfect thing. It's predicated on an engagement with another organisation to understand what they're doing and why they are doing it the way they are, and recognising the elements that help you think about your own situation and make improvements. It's the difference between the sort of benchmarking that we do in education versus the sort of thing that they do in factories that make stainless steel screws by the trillion load. Quite a different model.
So the other thing I want to just draw your attention to is this thing called Gresham's Law, which is a warning to not use benchmarking or quality measures unthinkingly. Because what this concept talks about is, if you're in an environment where somebody imposes something on you and says, this is the measure of what good is, it's a very natural behaviour then for everybody to do the thing that maximises the measurement of good. Which takes us back to where I started. Make sure we understand what success looks like. Don't iterate towards a high measure, iterate to what you believe success is for the environment that you're operating in. This is particularly important when we intersect with our thinking about what good qualities are with government agencies. Because classically, government agencies want measures that are simple to collect, not too expensive, and allow them to make very simplistic good-bad decisions. Unfortunately, by privileging those measures and that outcome, they stop people doing other things that might be really important, but that just don't happen to contribute to what that measure actually says is good. And it's a recipe, and this is a really old example. You can see 1558 comes from the English Crown deciding that they would specify that a particular piece of coinage had a particular value in the economy rather than its the amount of gold that was actually in it, which then allowed the Crown to increasingly replace the gold with other metals and yet tell everybody, no, it's still worth exactly the same. And of course, what smart people did is they collected all of the old gold coins and kept those, and all of the bad adulterated coins ended out in the circulating economy. The bad money drove out the good. So we're trying to avoid those situations by having good measures that actually measure what we value, not things that are perhaps easy or obvious, or driven by either regulatory agencies or often vendors. Vendors will make a whole bunch of measures really easy to collect. Got to ask yourself, are those things that we actually care about? Do they relate to the success that we're after? So just to make the point too, it's not just the measures that determine how a benchmarking environment works. There are lots of different ways you can assess quality, and these are all higher education ones. You've got some things that are about a peer review process. So somebody looking at what you're doing and telling you they think it's good or bad. Comes down to whether or not you believe that that peer is a good assessor of the value that you care about. There are a lot of people who have tried to make TQM, which is to say total quality management, work in education. It doesn't work. It's a dumb idea. It's a really stupid thing to try and do in higher education, because total quality management is predicated on the fact that you know what the ultimate quality of the thing you're trying to achieve is before you do anything else. And so everybody then spend a huge amount of time arguing about what that is and not actually getting on and doing that. Maturity models, got to advertise my own research in this space, built around this concept that organizations are a lot like people. They have levels of maturity in terms of their capability to do an activity well and then to learn from that and to improve systematically and purposefully. So there's quite a structure to that sort of thing. And now we have the ACODE benchmarks. And the thing about the ACODE benchmarks is they don't try and specify what we're trying to go towards. So they're not making the TQM mistake. The ACODE benchmarks are a collaborative activity. The entire purpose of an ACODE benchmark is the conversation that it stimulates. So the points that Kathy was making before about engaging with people and talking with wider groups, that's the activity that we want to support with this benchmark. The real value of it, of the questions that we ask and the conversations that we support in our universities and then the ones that we have between universities, that conversation is the value, that process. The actual number you get at the other end is sort of meaningless. And in fact, it's sufficiently meaningless that one of the things that you really have to do when you're doing ACODE benchmarking, particularly those universities that have done it more than once, is you really need to try and capture the conversation you're having when you're making those assessments and keep those records, because 2 years later, when you come back and look at what you did and look at that rating, you're going to ask yourself, were we on drugs when we said that? Do we really think we were that good? If you don't know why you gave yourself that rating, you don't know why your assessment of yourself has changed and moved on, and you can't necessarily have a good conversation with your organisation about the fact that before COVID, we thought our online tools were really, really good. After COVID, yeah, they're not. and particularly when we think about accessibility and inclusion, the nature of the space is as we engage more in it and the more that we have conversations about it, people's expectations shift. So their initial reaction, their initial assessment, oh, this room's pretty good, it's well assessed, it's well accessible, I'm happy with it, done. A couple of years later, no, not really. So it's supporting that outcome. So the important thing to understand about collaborative benchmarking is it's entirely possible for your assessments under that to go backwards. Very normal behaviour to have happen. And it's very normal to say, I'm a 4 this year and I'm a 4 2 years from now for doing completely different things in response to the same issue. But that 4 out of 5 represents your confidence that it's mostly okay, whatever that might mean for a particular measure. So, and as I said, you've got these slides, so you don't need to worry too much about the word wall that's in here. There's a bunch of critiques that I've done and others have done as well about writing standards well and thinking about the things that go into benchmarks and into measurement standards. And I think the very simple way to summarize what's on this slide is to say it's really important to be very focused on what success looks like, what the outcome you're trying to achieve is, and desperately try to avoid specifying how you get that. Because the mechanisms that we use to achieve those things
are changing on us incredibly rapidly. I mean, I 3 or 4 years ago, I would not have I'd have been laughed out of the room for talking about the ways that we can use some of the AI tools that are now available to us to do various things. People just believe that's entirely not possible and shouldn't be used as a reference. Now our expectations have changed a bit. So I have given you on your tables these as a checklist. And each of these comes from critiquing the things that are used as measures in different quality standards, higher education standards. It's available online as a PDF as well. And one of the things about this is that each measure has to be able to be clear and stand alone on its own merits. So the 9 questions that we have right now are an attempt to try and meet these, and each of these questions should be asked against any proposed measure. Not only the measure itself, but also the 5 or 10 or 15 standards that then sit underneath each of those measures. You have to ask yourself, does it really meet any of these criteria? A really critical thing, and something that's a real bugbear of mine with some of our existing benchmarks, anytime there is the word "and" in the middle of a benchmark statement, there is a problem, because it's this and it's that. Okay, what if it's not really very much of the latter and quite a lot of the former? Is that halfway in the middle, or is it? And as a programmer, we know about this. We have things like ORs and XORs and ANDs and exclusive ANDs. And we know how to combine things together and say, it's not enough that you have this one or that, you have to have both of them. It's okay if you just have one or the other. We specify. Really hard to do that in a benchmarking statement. It's also a really bad idea to have benchmark statements that contain values within them. So a benchmark statement that says that something is sufficient. Well, the sufficiency is the assessment you make. Say what it's meant to do. Whether or not it's sufficient is the judgment call that's made when you assess against it. So everyone really wants to write into benchmark statements that it's efficient or sufficient or cost effective or those things. Yeah, try not to do that, because whether or not that's present is your assessment. So Kathy queried that, is it resourced, one that's in the benchmark? And that's actually language we use throughout the benchmarks, and we've used it pretty consistently. And the answer to the question about what does that mean is, I don't know. What does it mean for you? Do you have the resources you need to do what you're doing? So that's why it's expressed in that language in the current indicator that we have. But the most important one is that number 16. Are you asking people a question about something that can be changed? There's really not a lot of point benchmarking something that you don't have agency over. And so it's the Vice Chancellor gives me all the money I need. That'd be nice. Probably not a lot of point collecting that benchmark. Also, the measures have to be, it says, accessible and affordable. What that really means is, if you can't get a good answer, or if it's really going to be painful to get that question asked and answered in a reasonable period of time, probably not worth bothering with. There's probably other things you could function that are going to be more practical. We're all about pragmatism here. We're about asking ourselves questions that we can act on, or that we can use to influence other people to act, which is sort of an interesting audience question. So I've got some examples of, I'm a bit cruel to Steve. Steve gave me 22 measures of accessibility drawn in a completely reasonable way. And I said to him, well, the bad news is I'm going to give you fewer, because 22 is way too many measures. But I'm also going to give you, I'm going to use the examples you gave me to come up with some don't do this responses so people can see what it is you shouldn't do. Thank you, Steve.
And I will thank ChatGPT.
Yeah. So this was
I would think it's all gathering here to discuss this as we would want to discuss it.
Yeah.
See examples work through.
Yeah. Does the institution publicly share its progress on meeting accessibility? Any ideas what the problem might be with this measure in the light of what we're trying to do with the benchmark today?
Yes or no?
Yeah, there's a bigger problem. Why do we care? Why is it in scope? What does this have to do with being better at supporting the accessibility of our students? So this is a scope question. Is this actually in scope for what we're trying to do? It sounds like a good idea, but why do we care about marketing? So I don't mind marketing doing their job, but is it a TEL benchmark to help us be better at what we're doing? Interesting political question there. Singular and focus. To what extent does the institution have a structured governance model overseeing accessibility and inclusion? Do you have governance? Simple's better. Doesn't need to be structured governance. Well, whether or not it's structured is going to be your assessment of how well it's actually working for you. That's a value word sneaking in there. I have done a bit of a trick, and you'll see it in the version that got emailed out last night. We started with accessibility and inclusion, which immediately raises the question in my mind, how are we distinguishing between what's accessibility and what's inclusion, and do we have to have in every single benchmark two separate measures? The measure successful. I've redefined accessibility so that it encompasses inclusion, if that makes sense for you. Singular focus. Yeah, and you can play with the words. There is a stylistic thing, which I'm just making the point here. The ACODE benchmarks tend to make statements rather than ask questions. It's just a way we phrase it. So it's just been how we've landed over time. Okay. So this one, most of our benchmarks have 5-point scales underneath them. Some of them have 2 or 3 5-point scales on them because we had an and in the top, and now we have to measure multiple things in one place. But what can folks see as the problem with this particular set of measures against the standard? Yeah, so we've got students and staff, which is a problem. So there's a specificity problem. But so number of issues there. The word specific, yep, that's a value problem. Addressing support, accommodations, inclusion. Okay, so that's 3 things I'm now measuring. 4 students and staff, so I'm now measuring 6 things. Am I going to have 6 measures? Okay, that's crazy. So that's a problem. Now let's look at the actual measure. Let's assume we got a good measure at the top. What about our 5 bullet points? What do we notice about our 5-point scale here?
Not TEL related.
Yeah, there is a bit of a problem with that. They're answering different questions. Each one of them is a response to a different expectation. It's like bugbear of people who know how bullet points work. Bullet points should be semantically equivalent. These are not semantically equivalent members of the same scale. They are 5 different scales at different levels of activity. So that's a problem. Now, one of the things hopefully we can do in the work that's following, under our measures, one of the questions I'd like you to ponder is what is the performance scale that makes the most sense for that benchmarking statement that we've got there. So if we talk about the governance statement that we made earlier, what is the dimension of governance that we wish to use to scale between we're not doing a very good job through to we're doing a great job and we're comfortable with what that is? And there are a bunch of different ways you can come at that with these measures. You can do a quantity thing. There's none of it happening, or there's a lot of it happening. A really easy thing to do, except sometimes doing a lot is not actually the thing that we care about. So the question is, you've got a statement at the top which specifies a thing that we would like to achieve as an outcome. The question to answer is, what are the dimensions of that we value, that we would want to talk to people about that meet all those other criteria we talked about earlier. They're visible to us, we can act on it, we can measure it, we can engage with it productively to make decisions that people value. So that's the question to think about when you're looking at those statements. Does the measure enable improvement to occur? When our goal is not alignment with something that UNESCO states. Our goal is that we've given ourselves the systems and structures that allow us to do the improvements we need to do in our own organisation. So that's the thing that we focus on. It's the measure that we care about. And it's really tempting to use external compliance with different things. Sometimes those are important parts of your response to the benchmark. They might be legally required of you. They might be actually really useful and practical ways that you can articulate it. But often the benchmark really wants you to talk to people about, why did we choose that one? Why that international standard? How is that relevant to our situation? How are we using that standard in a way that allows us to make good progress, rather than just ticking a box that said we can put this on our website and market ourselves as compliant with this or accredited by that. The other and the meta thing about all of this work, it's really important that the conversations you have are connected to your leadership structures of the organisation, the people who want to do things in the place, and the things that they are prepared to engage with. And no amount of time I've spent working with people doing benchmarking activities and quality activities, start with the question, what does your boss value and want to achieve? And how is what we're doing part of them achieving that? And how do we get them involved from the beginning so that they're part of the process and therefore invested in using what we generate in a way that's materially effective? Because you can spend a huge amount of time with a bunch of people in rooms really getting energized about something, and then it ends up on the shelf with all of the other reports that just didn't quite line up with where you are as an organization. And it's a really depressing thing. Sometimes great work, it's just not the right time. It's just, and as someone who spent a very long time working in universities, we can outlast the particular priorities of the day, and we can be ready to strike when things come through. Yeah, good ideas have their moment, and if it doesn't work today, well, take it away anyway. And then chance favours the prepared mind. So, and the good news is with the slides, you get the ads. So both my own work and work that I've done with Michael and other colleagues. So there is actual research behind some of this, believe it or not. But really, I use this bottom quote quite a lot, in that it's a real problem when we measure and we think about the qualities of things, that we assume the history of what has worked in the past is a reliable guide to what we should be working on to do for the future. Really have to assess what you believe your current needs are, not what they were a year ago or 2 years ago, but also give yourself more options in the future, rather than assuming that you follow a particular path to success based on historical patterns. Because my sense of the space that we operate in now is that the future is really an undiscovered country. It really is, in terms of what's going to be important to us. I mean, 2 years ago, we really didn't care about AI. If we had leant too heavily into certain things 2 years ago, we would be regretting that now. So we need to be able to invest in things that we know that aren't going to change, because they're about our characteristics and properties as humans, and those things don't change, but also that give us the opportunity to take advantage of opportunities that present as the world moves us into different places.
Sections of the potential benchmark that we're building were shared out last night in an email to you. And with the move to the Padlets, which Sheila kindly developed for us, we have a couple of questions that we want you to engage with. They're horizontally across, there are the 9 sections of the proposed benchmark, from evaluated and resourced, back to governance and strategic plan. And then the questions that we want you to consider as you work through those 9. Number 1 is we'd love you to assess the section headings and discuss whether we have all the areas covered. When you think about accessibility in an institution, there's lots of people who have different remits, different focuses that all intersect around and potentially contribute to making things more accessible within your institution. So do we have it covered with those 9 potential areas? And then within your groups, we'd love you to discuss, create, and add to the Padlet some draft questions, taking on board all of Stephen's fantastic advice, and using Grok and ChatGPT will possibly lead you astray, as Stephen so kindly pointed out. And finally, the third question we'd like you to explore in your groups is to reflect on the proposed questions that you and your group have created and identify whether this is an ed tech issue, quote unquote. Is it an ed tech issue? Or is it something else? And that goes back to the idea that we could measure lots of things, but is it actually core to what ACODE's about? And that is about providing better, more responsive ways for supporting student learning through ed tech, the use of ed technology. Okay.
Did we have good conversations about what we want?
Yeah.
Excellent.
Yes.
Yeah. So first question to everyone, what should be number 10 in that list, or perhaps number 0 in that list? What did we forget?
Oh.
Did we find anything? Definitions? Yeah. So one of the features of the fully elaborated benchmarks, if folk have looked at the others, we do have a bit of a preamble where we spend some time framing specifically what's in here. And for each of the benchmarks, we also make a good practice statement where we unpack some of the things that should be present when people think about those things. And again, we try to not over specify because we want to make sure that people can choose their own way of achieving the outcome. But for example, having a definition of what you understand accessibility to mean in your organization, that's, to me, is something that absolutely should be addressed in benchmark number 3 there. I mean, if you've got policy about the space, that policy should be really clear. And we talked a bit about this in our table about you can start with the legal definitions, but then there are other ways of coming at that speak to your culture and your values and your aspirations as an organization. So your definition may talk in very much broader ways. And there's a lot, it's really critical, particularly when you're scoping things like your policies, to be clear how you're distinguishing. For example, we have policies in our university about te tiriti. So a lot of things that are about inclusion and speaking to Te Ao Māori would not be in the same place that you would find our other inclusion and accessibility policies. So you've got to find your own path for that. Anything else that came up that you don't know if it's got a home in here yet? Trevor?
I think we probably put it under number 3, but operational plans sort of was probably an aspect that we saw in other benchmarks that's not this one. It does refer to strategic plan number 2. We put probably op plan either under 3 or in its own right.
Yeah, and if you look at some of the other benchmarks, sometimes we unpack the strategic plan thing a little bit more and say, look, there's got to be clear goals, got to be evidence that those are achievable and that there are plans in place to make them happen. So we sort of unpack what we mean by strategy to stray towards operational plans. There's a whole different argument about what's a strategy versus a plan. It's good to have those conversations with an adult beverage in your own time. All right. I'm just conscious of time, and I'm hoping that people have collected their feedback and their thoughts in the Padlet or on the pieces of paper, because that'll obviously feed into a process where we try and draft the next version, and then that will be an ongoing process to engage with. But I'm going to work my way down through the benchmarks and get people's comments and reactions to each one. We did a couple of things on our table, which was, does the statement actually frame this in the right way? And then what are the scales that might be used against that? So some cases there's more than one. Some cases we've focused it a little bit more tightly. So governance, thoughts about governance in the accessibility space?
We're also tripping up over the term technology enhanced learning, because on the one hand, you want to call it out, and my group members can jump in at any point. You want to call it out and make sure that it's addressed. But on the other hand, it's already ubiquitous, right? It should be integrated in the institution's response and approach to teaching and learning. So is it already embedded and we are artificially pulling it out and then causing confusion? Or do we address it separately, or do we find a way to do both?
Yeah, so I think one of the things that's important to keep in mind here is exactly that, in terms of, is there governance oversight? It doesn't say it has to only be governance oversight of TEL or TEL accessibility. It could be that you've got an incredibly effective governance mechanism operating in the learning and teaching space that in its terms of reference has a really clear focus on accessibility as well as pedagogy and other things. And if that's doing the job for you, great. We don't care. We're agnostic about the mechanism. The thing that we did wonder about in our table about this one, and something that came through really strongly in Kathy's presentation, was partnership, co-governance. And so one of the things that we pulled out that we would perhaps want to add into that flagship statement is explicitly saying, no, it's not enough that you've got governance, it's got to be shared governance or partnership or co-governance. Because that feels like something that if we took this out to the broader accessibility inclusion community, that's something that's very strongly articulated as a value. So something we want to think about there.
We talked about that as well, that when you're actually assessing these things, like, you know, a piece of software, for example, that the user, the end user, should be involved in assessing whether it actually is up to snuff, not just just a bunch of middle managers.
And not the manager of the group that thinks they own it. Yeah. I'm going to keep us moving, just conscious of time. I want to finish this cleanly at past. Strategic plans addressing TEL. Again, related to the governance piece, we talked a lot about what is it that you expect from a strategic plan focus on TEL, and it's basically got to be something that has a clear goal, something that you can see can be achieved, it's reasonable, and then some way of measuring whether or not you're heading towards it. That seems to be the main value there.
Yeah, Steve. Yeah, look, the first thing was it was a bit of a yes/no question, so that was out for us in the first place. And also, similar to governance, there should be that idea of a partnership model somewhere embedded in that benchmark as well, because out of every strategic plan, there's an action plan as well, and also partnership that should be there, you know, from woe to go. So in that planning, but also in the deployment afterwards, and that would make it much stronger.
Yeah, and the other thing to keep in mind here is that although this says strategic plan, as do most of our benchmarks, there's no assumption that there's a singular thing. These are articulated in different universities in a wide variety of ways. Same point applies, by the way, to procedures, policies, guidelines. All right, let's move on to that. So the table I was sitting at, one of the things that's a feature of our benchmarks is when we list multiple things, you need to test, are those things that we separately want to get a response from in order to get a good sense of where organisations are. So in this case, we think there is some value in being able to distinguish between whether you've got good, clear policies that are actually setting an expectation, whether or not you've got some mechanism for turning that policy into a business process and action. So the procedural thing, which embodies an operational responsibility, but then also, how do people understand those things? Where's the amplification, the guidance to help people understand that when we say this thing in the policy, this is what we really mean, and this is what good looks like, and all those great things. So it feels like this one has three measures under it. All right, policy is any good, is there any way to turn a great policy into actual action? And does anyone understand what we were talking about in those other two columns? But any other comments, thoughts here?
We also said, has it been monitored?
Yeah, so monitoring gets sucked into number 9 in terms of evaluation. So it's and this is something constantly in the benchmarks, we have to make sure that we don't recursively include every other aspect of the benchmark within every measure. It's a very common way that they get a bit out of control. So yeah, it comes up in a couple of the other things too. Sheila.
Yeah, our group also talked about that idea of collaboration, identification of any gaps. So, you know, like a review, you know, kind of element in that benchmark as well, to ensure that, you know, people are working together through those benchmarks to inform whether they're hindering or limiting processes, treating them as dynamic, because quite often, particularly procedures, can be very limiting, whereas the policy might be overarching, but the procedures are very limiting. So we'd like to see something in the benchmark about that continuous review or some sort of dynamic nature to it.
Yeah, and my sense is that we could probably pull that into 9, but it's a good point, because whenever someone says evaluated or assessed, should always ask by whom, in what way, and to whose ends. So who is setting the goal here? So I think continuing the theme a little bit, any really good assessment, evaluation, self-reflection, improvement of TEL accessibility services, first question is talk to the end users of those services. Do they believe they are getting what they need from this? Would be an obvious. And in doing that, are they part of defining how that is done? So that you don't just hit people with a survey that somebody wrote thinking they understand their situation. So co-developing right from the very beginning would be a strong thing there. All right, going to keep us moving. Staff development. So this one was we spent a lot of time on number 4. And I'll speed us up by saying, let's talk about 4 and 5 together, because essentially they're two different sides of the coin in terms of development support. And you'll notice in the benchmarks, we already have a staff development and training benchmark and student development and training benchmark. So remember, this exists so that people can holistically assess their TEL accessibility activities without having to do those other benchmarks. We know that that's a thing that institutions frequently want to do. So it's in that context. Nigel.
I think one of the things that we discussed around about 5 was this sense, Leslie, one of the things that came up this morning was how students could take their own technology into spaces and use that. And I think that benchmark needs to be careful that it allows for that and isn't just teaching students how to use the existing technology to shoehorn them into what you've decided that works for them.
One of our tables actually talked about in this space 2 measures. We said, one, that there's got to be support and resources and development provided. So that's one thing, that they have to be there. Second one, we said, is they have to be valued and valued by the people who are the audience, the users of that. And if we're saying to people, well, look, you can do it, but you can only do it this way, they don't value that.
Yeah. So that's maybe not related, but in terms of 4, I suppose one of the discussions we had there was, are we just measuring the fact that staff development is provided, or are we then measuring what comes from that staff then use that to make their materials accessible?
Yeah.
Because it didn't really seem to be captured in, I think it's 7. So it's the accessible learning platforms.
Yeah. So, and I noticed the comment just came up on the chat as well. Yeah, this is why we were talking about value. And we spent a lot of time talking about whether effective was a good measure or used and things like that. And we came back to valued because it tended to, if something is valued, it's used. Yeah. But if it's not, then it isn't. And part of what you mentioned, I think, Nigel, we also assess possibly with 6 and 7 in that the thing that we actually care about, this is like student success and retention. You can do anything you like, but the key measure is, are the students retained and are they passing
Yeah.
courses and continuing? So every other measure is pointless. That's the one we actually care about. Trevor.
Okay. The physical learning spaces 6 and the digital learning platforms, we had some conversation around whether they should be the physical learning experiences and the digital learning experiences rather than the spaces and the platforms. It does get a little bit broad. There's some risk of that because then you come back to number 4 about creating content and integrating technologies. But that's that got a bit of conversation at our table.
Yeah.
I actually wonder, Stephen, number 4, we talked about the use of and staff development on creating accessible content and integrating those technologies into learning. I'd say a lot of universities do invest a lot of time in helping people make accessible PDFs.
Yeah.
But then the second part is not really touched at all, and I could just see that has some risk of being a 1 and 5.
Yeah, and we did talk about the way that you put sort of brackets around parts of this, and it's for this one we care about the effectiveness of the state development. We're not in your Caleb. We care about staff development and its impact and value. The scope of the focus on is probably less important, so we sort of put a bracket around that and say staff development in this. Well, we're running out of time, so I'm going to probably pull this to a bit of a close. Is there any other observational point someone would like to make that we haven't had the opportunity yet to?
Just as Darren pointed out earlier, we just want to make sure we hold the procurement and vendor accountability in there somewhere. We put it down under 7, but I don't think it fits very neatly there.
Yeah,
it's got to basically be in any physical procurement or digital procurement, right? So I do agree with you on that.
Yeah, I mean, I would hope that if that was something people were conscious of, and perhaps we put this into the guidance, it really should be part of your procurement policies. It is a hygiene factor. And honestly, I'd be surprised at the moment if there are any institution that doesn't have that already in their procurement policy, that there needs to be some compliance with the relevant laws.
Steve, there's a link back there to governance as well, obviously.
Yes, there is.
Yeah, look, I think so, Darren. I know this says most in Australia don't. We know that this is a particular point of tension, and it may be that it deserves its own line there that says basically in your procurement, what does success look like? It looks like having students and staff at the table. And so basically, and I actually think that a lot of universities would come in as a 0 in some of this, a 0 to 1. And if what we end up with is that procurement is an inclusive, collaborative process that makes sure that the actual experience is the outcome, that would be a really good thing. And if this benchmark can help drive those conversations, that would be, I think, if that's the only thing we achieve, that would probably be a good one.
Just to add to that, Stephen, just to add to that, I think that sort of question would actually also help us pick up things that there's an assumption here that the institution is doing all of the procurement of technologies when there's often a number of academic choices which are, crossing over the governance piece. But if procurement of technologies is chosen, then we're picking up institutional and discipline specific and individual choices.
When we talk about digital technologies, the digital technologies we have may not be sufficient for students. So they may need specialist technologies. For example, a computer in a lab may need to be kitted out specifically for a student with a disability, or they may need specific tools. So do we have the mechanisms in place to select technologies for those accessibility requirements?
That would be the response that you would give to whether your environments, your physical space is resourced, whether it is accessible. So that is what I would expect people to be arguing about around a table in their institution, about the fact that, yep, it's great if you're in the business school in their lovely rooms, while those of us somewhere else, it's not great. So it's that sort of conversation that we expect to happen with your colleagues in your own institution.
Right. So I think we're gonna say sayonara to Stephen Marshall. Hand over to Patrick, he's got a comment.
Sorry, I just wanted to play devil's advocate there at the end. I'm thinking of the longevity of the benchmarks. I would say recommend we don't put procurement as an explicit. I would say that should be covered under our first response to benchmark 10, under policies to say, okay, in 2026, this is an issue for most people. Let's call it out. But when we do the benchmarks in the next couple of years, hopefully we've all moved on. Our responses would say procurement's covered now. We've moved on to our next set of policy and procedure and guidelines. Because I'm just thinking, these things, you know, when did we invent these 10 years ago? Like, they need to have a long shelf life rather than the point in time. Yeah, but if my counter is if we start to call out specific elements, where do we stop? So if we stop, procurement, and then okay, what about then this element, then that element, then that element? We start to get a laundry list rather than saying contextually. So if I stick my hat on, we actually have a staff member who is an accessibility officer in the procurement office, and it's part of all of our legal and risk compliance in our procurement that this is handled. So, you know, we're just not all in the same state.
You get a five.
Never giving ourselves a 5 on anything.
I'm in the procurement department, we don't have that.
Yeah.
So thanks, Patrick. And I think that actually illustrates some of the thinking that needs to go into actually the development of the benchmarks, because one of the options is that we could put in our policies, in the line against policies, that lived experience or student input, or however we might frame it, is included in procurement and vendor as part of the line. We can take that out to the group basically, and in terms of as we develop, do we want to actually call it out for the moment, or do we want to actually have it as one of the scale items against our policies and procedures?
At this point, I want to make sure that if you are in an online group, that you've got all the content, all the things that you've been chatting about typed in. Those will be available. So if something pops into your head this evening, tomorrow, please keep adding. Feel free to add to those Padlets, because all of that is going to be exceedingly valuable in the conversations that come. In terms of the folks in the room here, please make sure you leave all of your documents on the table. We will try and figure out the chicken scratch that is your writing, but we really appreciate your contributions. And at this point, I think it's probably really good to indicate that this is a start of a process, and we're now going to be going forward with looking for people to join the working group from those ACODE institutions to help us get together a group of like-minded people who want to see this space better. And to provide an opportunity for sharing of good practice and continual improvement at an institutional level through the next benchmarking process next year in Melbourne, when we'd hope to run this for the first time and share that outcome. So in terms of those people that have registered, everybody here is registered clearly. Please send an email to the Secretariat at acode.edu.au, or myself or Kate or whoever your contact is. Let us know if you or somebody else within your institution would be an ideal person to be involved in the benchmarking development, because that's the next steps for us, and hopefully get something that we can use by this point next year for the benchmarking. So thank you everyone for your time. And I'm going to hand it over to Kate to do final words.
Well, thank you. What a great day. So, look, firstly, before I close out, I'll just ask Sheila in the online group if there are any final comments or questions that anyone has with regard to the conversations that we've had today. Fairly unscathed. And hopefully you haven't felt excluded, because there's nothing worse than hanging out in an online group when everyone's having fun online. So any questions or comments? Yay, thank you.
Well, I can only speak for my group and our lot, but I think it's been really lively. In fact, it was so lively, we had people from other groups with our Padlet, and we thought it was AI. So great experience. We had lots of collaboration. Thank you, Kate.
Thank you, and thank you. I can see Darren on as well. Really appreciate the work that you've been doing with us, Darren. It's really important. NatSet is a very well-known, high-profile institution, and we very much appreciate the work that you've been doing, and hopefully will continue to do as we work on these as a collective group. So it has been very lively. There's lots of conversations, lots of passion in the room. When we built Benchmark 9, those people who engaged in the development of that, you know, the recognition is you get we write a paper, we actually do the work associated, you get authorship, there's a legacy with this work. You can walk away from the work you've done knowing that you've actually made an impact moving forward. But some of these benchmarks have been around for many, many years, and the people who have been involved in the benchmarking can, you know, be really proud of the work that they've done. So I would really like to thank hugely again Steve and the team from University of Auckland, everybody who's made the effort to come over, everyone who sat here online. I know what it's like to sit online, you know, for hours, and it's been great to be able to engage with you, touch on a couple of hot topics being artificial intelligence, etc., which remains and will continue to remain the topic of the moment, probably, I don't know, until I retire, maybe. So I would also like to hugely thank Zoe, our executive officer. This is Zoe's last workshop. And look, on behalf of the executive committee, we really are looking forward to a really bright future for ACODE. We do great work. We know we do that. We get lots of great feedback. We know we've got lots of lurkers, but that's great. You know, as a sociologist, you know, weak tie network is really important. You don't have to necessarily be overly active all the time, as long as you find ways to remain connected, and as long as when you need to connect, you know who to connect with quickly to be able to move yourself forward. So I feel quite comfortable that we have an organisation that people can connect with as they feel that they need. They don't necessarily need to feel pressured that you're actually, you know, you're not in the club. You can actually dip in and dip out. What we are asking of our members, though, is that you do kind of communicate within your institutions and make sure that everybody is aware of what we're doing, because the work is important and is valued highly. So hopefully we'll see you all next. So thank you. That's it. I think back to you, Steve, for a final goodbye.
Thank you for engaging with the day. I know that the Venn diagram, when you write up a Venn diagram of TEL and benchmarking, the intersection, the middle space between that usually is a pretty small one. It's a pretty niche area for benchmarks. And we're really happy that so many people engaged both online and here today. And so it's a great start to the conversation and the creation of the next benchmark. So thank you for engaging, and thank you for contributing. And hopefully we'll see some of you contributing in the future as we get started into the creation of Benchmark 10.